Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, we took a little bit of a break. I was on vacation out in the Southwest. I got to go to Roswell. I got to meet up with a lot of interesting people, including Bryce Zabel, John Alexander, Nick Pope. It was pretty wild. Had a great time, though, just taking a couple of weeks off from work and time off from podcasting. It was really nice and really relaxing. And I guess nothing happened while I was away. It's been pretty quiet on the UFO front. Is that right?
That's pretty much it. We just got together, and we'll have to try to cobble together a few items to make an episode, because not really too much going on.
Man, bummer. That's too bad. Yeah, and of course I'm kidding. For those of folks who've been paying attention to what's been happening in UFO world, a lot has been going on. We talk about this a lot, Darren, that the speed of developments is even hard for us to keep track of, because the news cycle of things that are happening is so rapid now. And we forget that, oh, that was just a few days ago. Remember when that sort of news bit dropped. It's easy to forget those things. I will remember where I was when I saw the biggest piece of news, I think, that happened in the last few days, at least to me in my mind. We were at the tail end of our vacation. We had just gotten through turning in our luggage, checking our luggage at the ticket counter at the Denver International Airport, an airport that I'd never been in before. Of course, those of you who are interested in UFO history, there's a lot of lore around the Denver airport that is pretty wacky. So I'm in this airport. We checked our bags. We get down the escalator. And I'm looking at this long, snaking TSA security line. And I'm going, oh, that's a really big line. And then I realized that the line doesn't even start there. It actually starts around the other side of the airport. So we had to walk around to the other end of the opposite terminal. It felt like half a mile, and it seems like an exaggeration, but I think it really was. Just a huge line of people. So while I'm sitting in this line, walking with everybody, I'm checking Twitter like I do, and lo and behold, here's this press release from Senator Schumer's office with this draft legislation. And it's not legislation like we've been used to seeing, where unidentified anomalous phenomena or UAP is sort of mentioned a little bit. It's incredibly detailed legislation. It's pages and pages and pages of information. And instead of using language that is, I think, sort of subtle or maybe even vague, it's using some very direct terms. And so I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at all these human beings who are just going about their way in this airport, and I'm thinking, wow, things are changing, and this is historic, and people don't even necessarily realize it's going on. So that's where I was. I don't think I'll ever forget that. I don't know, where were you, and what did you feel when you saw that announcement?
Well, as is often the case, I was here at my cabin in the woods in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and when I saw it posted on Twitter, you just have to sort of sit down, take a moment, and just really recalibrate. That's really what it comes down to. Is it's not just one more piece. It's a major shift in the approach and the narrative. One of the things that's been most surprising to me is how we're not seeing a proportionate kind of rollout. I think when we're used to, obfuscation and suppression for so long, decades and decades and decades, that it kind of primes you with the assumption that when it finally begins to break, it'll be slow and it'll be measured. It has not really been that way, right? It's been league changes, orders of magnitude in terms of the kinds of language that's being used, the tone changes we're finding in public officials and spokespeople and whatnot while they're presenting this material, where it's very clear there's been some premeditation about having to shift quickly, right? We have this sense of urgency sort of baked into this. Everyone's been talking about this, not just that disclosure suddenly seems to be finally rolling out, but the speed, the pace at which it's rolling out is quite remarkable. So much so that one of the major talking points for those of us within ufology is, why so fast? What is it they know that's making them move so quickly? So we can get into that tonight, but there's plenty to get into. And I think we want to do this for people and for ourselves, because it's easy in the blur of so much going on to suddenly be on the other side of it But while we're in the midst of this right now, this meteor shower of disclosure moments, we really need to stop and try to notice each one and remark on how historic each one is and what it in total means in terms of where we're going from here.
100%. Here's what I said in social media after looking at the headline. And here's the headline from that press release. Just want to read it out loud. Schumer and Rounds introduced new legislation to declassify government records related to unidentified anomalous phenomena and UFOs, modeled after the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act as an amendment to the NDAA. So we have Chuck Schumer, the most senior Democratic majority leader in the Senate, and his colleague, Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican from the Senate as well, introducing this co-sponsored amendment to the NDAA. And then it goes on. I mean, there are some just incredible quotes in this language. But before I read some of them, what I said in social media was, look, you don't push for this from the highest Democratic congressional office on the eve of an election year if you aren't pretty damn sure that where there is smoke, there is fire. What a time to be alive. And that's how I felt in that moment going through that security checkpoint. Is this it really is kind of insane. If you think about Chuck Schumer being the leading Democrat within the Senate, one of the leading Democrats in the country, him putting this forward, promoting this language, it wouldn't have happened in a vacuum. It wouldn't have happened without some degree of consultation with the executive branch, because keep in mind, the executive is a Democratic president right now. So these folks absolutely do talk to each other, and they do talk about things that are going to either bring positive news to the party or negative attention to the party. Keep in mind as well that next year is an election year, so promoting this language in the NDAA on the eve of the election year is huge. It has big implications. It's you think about all the priorities that Congress may have on their plate right now with the war in Ukraine and climate change. All kinds of things happening. The economy, of course.
A little thing called AI.
A little thing called AI, another priority we've heard about recently. This is on that list. This is on the top list of things that they're focused on. I mean, it is absolutely mind-boggling. It's a bizarre time to be a UFO podcaster and interested in this topic. And let me read just some of the quotes from here. So the first one that is just wild to me, and I know you mentioned this before we jumped onto the show, is that this legislation is necessary because credible evidence and testimony indicates that federal government unidentified anomalous phenomena records exist that have not been declassified or subject to mandatory declassification review as set forth in Executive Order 13526, due in part to exemptions under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. So that's like super specific language there, and pointing a finger directly at that Atomic Energy Act from the 50s as sort of a pretense to shuttle away and obscure these records, this information, from normal procedural declassification review. So, Darren, what do you think about this? This is just crazy.
Absolutely. If you're someone like Mick West, as I said to you before we went on the air, I'm not sure how you're sleeping right now because your worldview is collapsing around you. Because what that legislation speaks to is not just that there's a there, as we keep saying on this show, but they even detail how these secrets were kept improperly, kept from Congress. They basically use clauses in Department of Energy kind of legislation to avoid this, knowing full well that was not what it was intended for. So it's one thing to say, yes, indeed, it is true. All of these things you've heard about for decades in the back rooms of ufology about there being this deep-seated secrecy campaign. Indeed, it exists, and this is how it actually was accomplished. That's what's amazing about this legislation. We're going to spend some time on this legislation alone because there's so many key points to get to. But to get to what you touched on earlier, to be clear to people, not all Congress people are created equal. Some people are on their first round as a congressperson, and they're a little bit naive and green behind the ears. Chuck Schumer is not that person. This is a legacy politician who knows the game inside and out, who by now crafts every single word he uses to be something he can defend, something he's not going to regret later. So for him to be taking such a front foot on this, specifically him, and to include language that he knows he will get called on. It will blow up for him if this language is not supported by the evidence, which again speaks to how much he knows about the evidence. I also want to introduce to people the notion that I've seen evidence that Chuck Schumer knew about this long before David Grush. So there are some people, we've heard about the Hillary Clinton campaign and how that was going to be a major move towards disclosure if she were elected president. As we all know, it didn't work out that way, but that was the first missed opportunity. But there's been this underground knowledge amongst some of the elite politicians, Chuck Schumer being right at the top of that list. So for him to come out so aggressively with this kind of legislation, using this terminology, which is shocking all of us, again, he of all people would not do this were it not for the fact that he knows exactly what the there is, and he's largely using this to basically prepare the rest of the government and the American people for what is to come. And clearly, again, when we think about the pace at which he's doing this, ideally you want to roll this out over years, right? We'll do this for 6 months, and then back half of the year we'll do this. This seems like something that would normally be like a 5-year campaign happening in the space of a few months, which again raises the question why, which we can get into that later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there does seem to be quite a bit of urgency. There are the forced errors that you make, and there are the unforced errors. When you have legislation that you can literally draft and sit on it, pore over it, edit it numerous times, and then publish it, you're going to be really careful about what it says. And in politics, that gives you an opportunity to trumpet that legislation as you're out there. You're stumping not only for your own position, but you're also stumping for other Democrats, other Republicans who are on the ticket, who are going to be a part of your party. So this is one of the issues that you're going to put in writing in detail and going to be promoting across the country as you're trying to get people to vote for your office. I mean, it's a huge deal. It's one thing to do that and be very deliberate about this kind of language. Another thing just to like, oops, I have an interest in UFOs, and that kind of came out. I didn't mean for the public to know about this, and I mentioned it in an aside, and it got picked up on a hot mic or something. I mean, that's a wholly different situation, right? And I'm glad you brought up the Clintons, because Chuck Schumer is a senator from New York. And who was a senator from New York? Hillary Clinton. So yes, there is absolutely a connection there to the Clintons and their interest in this topic. And of course, Podesta, who we all know about, and his connection to the topic. So these little pieces of information, it's in there. It's in the fabric of the story. And it's not just a fanciful idea. All of the facts are lining up in a way that, clearly are beginning to paint a more detailed picture beyond just mere conjecture. So it's really an exciting time to be alive. And, there are more quotes in this legislation. Do you want me to jump into one of those, or do you want to come back on what I just said there?
Well, just make one point, and that is, to the point you just made about Podesta, we then think about Tom DeLonge and the tie-in there in WikiLeaks, right? So all of this connects together. Those of us who've been in the weeds of this for years now start connecting the dot. Tom DeLonge, TTSA, talking to generals, this goal of using the younger generation to spill the beans, so to speak, because there is a movement within to want to get this out. Podesta being one of the people talking to Tom DeLonge. Like you say, Podesta being intimately connected to the Clintons, who's intimately connected with Chuck Schumer. Now Chuck Schumer taking the front foot on crafting legislation that takes us from first base to seemingly third base. We wanted to get to first base. We're now at third base. I mean, now when you ask yourself, what's left? What's left for us to really be able to say this counts as capital D disclosure? We are not far away, which again, is just shocking. It speaks to the pace at which things are rolling out.
Absolutely. All right, here's a great quote from this proposed amendment. It defines non-human intelligence. So the phrase non-human intelligence appears over a dozen times in the pages of this amendment. And the definition here is as follows. The term non-human intelligence means any sentient, intelligent, non-human life form, regardless of nature or ultimate origin, that may be presumed responsible for unidentified anomalous phenomena, or of which the federal government has become aware.
I mean, one of the things we talked about, I think on the last show, or at least it was the talking points that week, was when are we going to get to the beings, right? We went from, is this drones, is this China, is this Russia, to suddenly, no, this is something more sophisticated than that. It's running circles around our aircraft. It's seemingly defying the laws of physics as we understand them. It's not operating like an aircraft really at all. to suddenly now, like you say, in the legislation, not only do they use a term like non-human intelligence, but then they define it. And they make it clear that regardless of origin, which again, right there says, be prepared for some different options on the table. This, again, is striking because we went from, again, first base, seemingly, I'm not sure what happened to second base. We just went right to third, right? Somebody hit a double and somebody like ran, got to get some sports analogies in here. We're always default to football, so let's use baseball. I mean, and suddenly you wake up and you go, what's happened? Like, we've actually said non-human intelligence. Clearly, it's not the Chinese and the Russians if it's non-human intelligence. Clearly, we're saying we're not even limiting it to extraterrestrial. Now we're saying we need to open the conversation, open the aperture to a broader discussion about different kinds of origins. Even Gallagher talking about the possibility this could be an ancient civilization that we're just now seeing sort of come to the surface, or we're just becoming aware of them. Maybe, again, this ties in with what's going on in the world, which is so daunting, which is impacting them as well, which is causing them to come to the surface and interact with us and intervene with us and whatnot. So many profound questions now arising when we think about what's in this legislation.
It's truly bonkers. Even though I've been digesting this now for several days, and obviously we've been talking about it for years, it's still absolutely crazy to see it in writing. I didn't think we would be at this place right now where this type of language would literally be proposed and making its way into the defense bill. I mean, insane. Another great quote from this legislation here is the definition of technologies of unknown origin. Again, talking about the origin here, the term technologies of unknown origin means any materials or metamaterials, we've heard that phrase before, ejecta, crash debris, mechanisms, machinery, equipment, assemblies or subassemblies, engineering models or processes, damaged or intact aerospace vehicles, and damaged or intact ocean surface and undersea craft associated with unidentified anomalous phenomena or in incorporating science and technology that lacks prosaic attribution or known means of human manufacture.
It's not this vague legislation. It's actually naming different kinds of objects, different kinds of mediums. That was mentioned there as well, underwater vehicles and those kind of things. Human and non-human defined over and over again. Like you say, material and metamaterial, things that were terms you only ever hear in the backrooms of ufology, now being used specifically in legislation. Again, I want to remind people, Chuck Schumer would not be including this language unless he knew this was part of the information. This is what needs to be disclosed. And again, from a legal point of view, he's also casting a very wide net so that whatever contractors possess these materials of these various sorts, they are put on warning now that this is what they're coming for, that we are not talking about hypotheses at this point. We're not prognosticating. We're not guessing. We're saying we know this is part of what the historical case has been. We are coming after it. We need to, and this is the key part, right? We need to fundamentally change how we've communicated with the American people about these things. Amongst all these other points we're making here, let's not forget the main point of this legislation is to say we need to change how we run our classification programs. There's been this overclassification on the one hand, and which also needs to be addressed on its own. And then secondly, there's been a blatant misuse of other kinds of clauses to avoid having to even report to Congress about these things. So you're seeing Congress people, we saw this recently with Tim Burchett and Anna Luna and people coming forward and saying that quite bluntly, this will not stand. You people are funded by the American people, by American taxpayers. We are their representatives. They elected us. You will answer to us. And if you do not, we will show up on your compounds at your Air Force bases, and we will hold press conferences from there, and we'll invite the press. I mean, they are now taking their front foot and saying very specifically, in a very determined way, we are taking the front foot here. You will answer to us. So that alone, I think for so many people that have spent decades in this, far longer than you and I have, step back and again, just remark at how different the situation is, not just the information, but who's taking the front foot and who's saying, you answer to us rather than the other way around. We think again about just this long history of incredible control by the military-industrial complex, and how we've had Eisenhower and presidents in the past warn us about this. And it seemingly seems like this dragon in the recesses of our country that we have no control over and no one really knows how to address. Well, this week we're seeing Congress people come out, again, on a bipartisan nature too, coming out and saying, this will not stand. We're coming for you. Make clear that you understand who you report to. You report to us, and best because we ultimately report to the American people, and we're going to make sure that constitutional norms are put back in place here. So again, just what a remarkable time.
Yeah, and I want to address a couple of the concerns that have been raised, as well as some of the interesting kind of tangential topics related to this proposal. So in the headline that I read earlier, of course, it mentions being modeled after the JFK committee. There's a lot of social media reaction to that. As many people know, it's a very long time. We actually still don't have all the records from the JFK review that had been done. There's, I think, 5,000 documents that are still going to remain seemingly indefinitely classified. But some were recently, additional documents were recently declassified by the Biden administration, including in one of those documents was the name of a gentleman who intercepted communication between Lee Harvey Oswald and the Russian government. And this gentleman's name, his last name is Efron. And the interesting tidbit about that was that he had a UFO sighting while being with a congressman, I think from Georgia, and a military officer. Well, they were touring the Soviet Union. They had a UFO sighting. So there's a weird, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, there's a weird maybe connection to UFOs and JFK. Before we kind of chase that rabbit, though, I mean, are you concerned at all about modeling this, committee or this action after the JFK declassification process? Should we think of them in the same way, or do you think this is a little bit of a different animal?
It's a good question. And normally in a normal situation, I would be concerned about that. If I thought that this was your standard, same old government trying to delay and say they're going to do something, but give themselves loopholes by which they can not do a lot for a long, long time. But I don't think that's the situation we're in. I think that clearly, again, the pace at which things are happening suggests that they are trying to get out ahead of something, which is a very different kind of scenario, which would produce a very different kind of response. While initially there were people firing back and saying, wait a second, JFK, I mean, that hasn't been all that good. But since then, when they've seen how quickly things have escalated, I think that's died down to some degree, and I think that's true. Now, what's also interesting, of course, when he mentions JFK is what many of us in ufology immediately go to is, well, what's the connection between JFK and the UFO phenomenon? And again, I've heard things that make it clear that there is a connection. I think these things are going to come out eventually. And again, this is why this is so shocking, because as I've said on previous podcasts, our understanding of the entire history of the 20th century is going to change. And I think we're seeing major moves towards that happening with this kind of legislation. How you roll this out, if you're a government, again, and try to hold that fine balance, find that sweet spot between making people believe you're being truthful now, while also acknowledging that there's been massive untruths and deliberate misinformation campaigns. And as David Grush has even talked about, even the murders of people who wanted to get this information out, which will undoubtedly become part of what becomes part of the public record as we move on here, even with some of these hearings. This is going to be such a tricky spot to walk through. And again, while Chuck Schumer, in the veteran he is, can get up there and talk about, yeah, we're going to be focusing on three main things: competition with China, AI, and transparency around UAP. I mean, again, you want to kind of shake your head and go, what did he just say? Right? I mean, this is what's on the plate here. And when you think about also the fact that one of the things that David Grush talked about was this new Cold War that's rolling out about who's going to master this technology first, then suddenly questions around AI and competition with China get wrapped up with transparency about the UFO phenomenon. So how are all these things working together, and how is this part of what's pushing the urgency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my take on the whole concern about the JFK modeling after that committee is that, well, look where that has gotten us. Sure, we don't have all the information about the JFK assassination, but the American public generally believes that our government was connected in some form or fashion to JFK's assassination. That is the general generally held conspiracy amongst the American population. Otherwise, the government would have told us everything that they know. It's been over 60 years. Everyone is dead. Everyone is dead. And so it would do them benefit just to shed some light on all the details there, but they're not. And I wonder why, because there's some culpability. And so to take that and kind of carry that over to this UFO issue, if they aren't as transparent, if they aren't really trying to get to the bottom of this and they conceal records, well, the public is going to continue to believe the longstanding conspiracy that has been going on for decades, that they're there, that there are UFOs there, and that there is a cover-up. So, if the intention is to continue the furtherance of the belief that UFOs are real, then and the JFK committee is a means of accomplishing that, well, then bravo, right? It's gonna happen. It's gonna continue to be true. So it's a very interesting time to be alive. I do think, and we touched on this in other episodes, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here for the government and really, quite frankly, for the world to coalesce around this issue and for a little bit of a redemption story here in kind of what happened in the 20th century, what has gotten us in the mess that we're in now with the tremendous amount of distrust that we have in our governments and our other institutions, what has gotten us to the place where we seemingly can no longer work with others who are on the opposite side of the aisle from ourselves politically. We're almost presented on a silver platter here with an opportunity to work together as a human race, to understand this and to carry us to another chapter in our story. And at least, I'm the optimist, right? You know that. This is where I hope it's going. I hope that this is going to allow us to rise to the challenge and to put behind us some of the things that have, I think, done tremendous amounts of damage to our not only our institutions but our societies, and to move forward with a new understanding of the way the world is, and a new sense of great connection and cooperation amongst the human family.
Absolutely. And I reminded the people this week on Twitter of words by Ronald Reagan around the era when he and Gorbachev were in communication, where he wondered aloud, many people wondered if perhaps he wasn't just wondering, what it would take to unite the human race, the human species. Would it be some sort of either perceived extraterrestrial threat, is kind of what he alluded to, but even any kind of reckoning with some sort of sophisticated intelligence that is not us, right? That this may be the one thing that shifts the equation, changes the context enough that we suddenly see more in common with each other than we see in terms of differences. And to that end, this week, Haley Morris, who worked in politics for a long time, was a Democratic campaign vet from 08 to 16. She quoted saying, "I worked in politics and on the Hill for nearly a decade. Never in a million years would I have predicted that the one issue both sides can agree on is UAP. Cheers to the Disclosure Act of 2023. So these are people that are like legacy people in Washington, used to seeing the same old, same old. And again, in their wildest dreams, even people who are UAP activists and believe in the importance of this topic, never in their wildest dreams thought there would be sort of this bipartisan approach and it be around the topic of UFOs. But even as we talk about going beyond the borders of our country, and how do we begin to have dialogues with what we perceive as adversaries, with China and Russia and whatnot, perhaps this is what changes the context enough for us silly chimpanzees who want to fight with each other and throw stones and say, wait a second, what's this monolith that's appeared over here on the tundra, right? These kind of things change the context, and sometimes that's what we need to kick us into gear. So that's perhaps what's on the plate here. And again, depending on what the nature of the revelations coming are, and again, we kind of been dancing around that. At some point we can talk about that. Maybe this is the thing, because of the urgency around whatever this thing coming is, that is what finally unites us, because we have no other choice, basically.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And let's not forget that other countries are also moving ahead with efforts with their populations to investigate or discuss this issue. We certainly know that Brazil is still actively talking about this in their governmental bodies. And then I'm reminded as well of the three-body problem, which is something that has been very highly popularized in the Chinese society It's an excellent trilogy. Those who haven't read it, it's a science fiction trilogy. But there's a common understanding in the Chinese culture, at least as far as I'm aware, that there's a lot less stigma around this notion of extraterrestrials or UAPs than there is here in the United States, and their culture is being more I guess open to this possibility. And if you are familiar with the three body problem, we talked about it on the show a little bit. It's not a straightforward extraterrestrial kind of story. It's a very complex, multi-layered discussion really about the nature of non-human intelligence, what it might be like, how it might interact with us, what it might mean for our reality. These are all things that I think are important. You and I have argued for this for very long. Important to keep in our toolkit as we're moving in and beginning to discuss these more broadly amongst our communities. And I think that conversation will continue. So those of you who are listening and have been following along, I think this is a good opportunity, right, to begin talking about this with your friends and family and bringing attention to it and just kind of testing the waters and getting some feedback and seeing where people are and what their interest level is, and point them to some of this language, right? The language that's in the amendment itself is a pretty good roadmap, I would argue, for starting that conversation and introducing even some level of nuance into the conversation, which is going to be sorely needed. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to discuss on that amendment, but if we can switch gears, not long after that was introduced, we had a press conference with the White House and, of course, the White House National Security Council. Admiral John Kirby is the one who kind of conducts those press conferences from time to time, and he had a couple of interesting things to say about UAP. He was basically saying that, of course the government takes UAP very seriously, and they've stood up an organization to focus on them and study them, and it's called AARO. And, that because I think that one of the journalists had basically asked, like, is this something we should actually be concerned about or thinking about or care about? And he said, and he's saying things like this: there is something our pilots are seeing. It has had an effect on our training operations, and we want to get to the bottom of it. We want to understand it better. And then, as you pointed out before the show, he went on to say, not saying what they are and not saying what they are not. Again, introducing some little bit of ambiguity, like a placeholder kind of language there, and a little bit of maybe neuro-linguistic programming to a certain degree, that there will be more to fill in the blanks of what they are in the future.
Absolutely. As our friend Kelly Chase pointed out, she said, quote, "It's crazy to see how quickly they've transitioned to acting like this is all boring and business as usual. Kirby pretending that he doesn't know about UFO stigma is just," then she does sort of the Italian,
it's that hand gesture
with the hand thing, yeah, which is so true. And this is the thing: when you're a politician or you're a spokesperson or you're a public relations person, you don't ease your way into the conversation. You just suddenly change tone, and you trust that people will, a lot of them, just be kind of duped into going along with it as if it has always been your modus operandi. So again, what she's pointing to here is not just that he's acknowledging that there's a there, right? Saying these things, some of these phenomena we know have already had an impact on our training ranges, but he almost took the tone of, well, of course, why even ask me about this? You know that we admit this. You know we've always wanted transparency on this, which again is quite opposite of what people have usually experienced, which prompted me to give this analogy. I said, as if I was talking from his voice here, of course, we all know Papa Smurf is out there on our test ranges smurfing around and such. Why else do you think the DOD established SORRY, smurfing objects of really ridiculous intent? We've always been about full transparency on these anomalous matters. That's how hilarious it sounds, that he's, again, not just acknowledging it, but he's acting almost like he's taking the front foot and saying, you guys need to get with the picture, right? We've been saying this all along. No, you haven't. This has not been your tone, but fair enough. We're acknowledging that you're taking this tone now, which again raises the question: why is there not just a shift in tone, but a sudden shift to the point where now it seems like he's completely done a 180 from where he was before? What does this all speak to?
Indeed. And then not long after that, press conference, we, of course, heard about another press conference that took place on the 19th. That was led by Representative Tim Burchett and Representative Luna, and I think Moskowitz. was present there, the Democrat, again, bipartisan press conference. So that was held to sort of discuss a little bit about what would be happening on the 26th. So this upcoming week, there will be a hearing in the House. There will be some whistleblower testimony there. We'll talk about who those people are in just one moment. But before we get to that, right before that press conference, kind of made the rounds, who happened to be on ABC News with a direct interview, and that was our good friend Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick from the office that you just lampooned a little bit there, AARO. And Kirkpatrick was asked some interesting questions. So the questions are getting a little bit better, right? The questions from journalists, which is what we want to be seeing. So the journalist asked him, is it possible there is some secret program that you're just not aware of? And Kirkpatrick says, I don't think so. I have access to anything and everything I need. And then you have on the other hand, so he's saying that out loud, but then on the other hand, we have Chuck Schumer who's saying, the executive branch was concealing information, the atomic, under the guise of the Atomic Energy Act of the 1950s. Both things can't be true. And so what is your take on this? And it seems highly coincidental that Kirkpatrick, who, as far as I'm aware, is very reticent to give interviews, was providing one, kind of a full-throated defense of his organization on the eve of a press conference that's really coming after the secrecy here.
It's interesting because, again, compared to Chuck Schumer, Sean Kirkpatrick is a low-level pawn, right? We're talking about the Senate Majority Leader crafting legislation that makes these points directly. It's not saying we're going to begin to investigate this because perhaps there's something there, and this has been in the back rooms of ufology for a long time. We think we owe it to the American people to begin to investigate. That's not what the legislation said. The legislation said this has been happening. This is exactly how it's happened. That's what's involved, non-human intelligence, metamaterials, it goes on and on. But to the point here, I think what we have here, I think you could argue, because I've been saying for a while now, what others have said as well, which is that raising the question, can we trust the intentions of Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick and his boss, Moultrie? We have to ask ourselves, are they really in good faith trying to get to the bottom of this? Or is that a bit of a disinformation campaign in itself? Is this meant to actually just kind of bury the topic? And now suddenly the rug is pulled out from underneath him, and he's having to answer for information that's being leaked and said directly from representatives much higher on the chain than him, right? Now, to be clear here, the issue is that AARO's reliance is largely on Title X authorities. And what people who are familiar with these topics are aware of is that special access programs, SAPs, the black projects that typically would have housed these legacy programs, typically require Title 50 authorities. He does not have Title 50 authority. So for him to answer in the way that he did, I would argue is almost a flat-out lie, because he must know that there are title authorities he does not have. And the question was asking about the relevance of the kind of programs that would have existed under Title 50 authorities, not Title 10 authorities. For him to say, no, I don't think so, I have everything I need, access to whatever I need, seems to me like the closest we've come to catching him in giving false testimony that he knowingly knows is false. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm reminded of what David Grush said in his interview with Ross Coulthard on News Nation about how there were programs, and here's a guy who had that kind of access and should have been able to see these programs very highly cleared. He said that there were programs he'd never heard of before, programs that he couldn't get access to. When he started to try to get access to them, that's when he started getting intimidated, and that ended up leading to his IG complaint. So it's quite strange. Again, I'm the optimist, and you'll often find me being very charitable in the UFO community. That's just what I'm known for. So let me play that card here with Sean Kirkpatrick. It's possible that Kirkpatrick, being this sort of stuffy, staid scientist person, acts as a little bit of a brake pad, if you will, on the ability of the information to kind of get too far ahead of itself. And in a way, there's a benefit to this stance that he's taking, because the stance that he's taking is this highly rational, highly objective, very materialistic perspective on verifiable evidence. You hear that word used a lot, verifiable evidence. And so he's this, sort of stereotypical scientist person. And if we reach a point where the evidence is verifiable, is so compelling, is so strong, that even he says, you know what, I've seen it, I've looked at it, I thought there was nothing there, but in fact there is, then that provides that same sort of social permission amongst that community of similar, highly rational, scientific individuals to say, well, okay, well, wait a minute, this guy who I looked at as being a very rationally minded person is now saying that there's a there. So that gives me permission. Remember, human beings are very mimetic. We like to copy each other. We look for that social permission. So they're seeing that, then they might say to themselves, well, I guess, maybe I can be interested in this and I can believe there is a there as well. That's my take on it. I could be completely wrong. And maybe, like, many things are sort of a little bit in between. It's a little bit of a gray area there. I'm not in the camp that says he's all bad, or all good either. I think there's a little bit of a gray area to it.
When Nathan invites Darth Vader over for lunch, he sees it as Anakin Skywalker.
Exactly. There, for the record.
He's a human being behind it all. Yes, I will say this, at least, that one thing he did say that was a bit of a shift in tone and wasn't born of the typical dry, highly scientific, mega objective kind of perspective was he said, people have been seeing things and we believe them now. He said something to that effect, that we've had these reports and we believe them now, something very much to that effect, which again will make people like Mick West uncomfortable, because what he's speaking to there is not just that these are anecdotal stories, but these are expert witnesses, pilots who have been trained with hundreds of hours to know exactly what friendly aircraft look like, what enemy aircraft look like, because, their lives depend on it and other people's lives depend on it. When you think about friendly fire, when the really unfortunate circumstance where you think something's a threat, you blow it up and you find out it was an ally that you just blew up, right? So you really want to know to a T whether that's a MiG or whether that's, a U.S. aircraft kind of thing, right? So these people are saying, we know what the available inventory in the world basically is. And not only is this next gen, but it's doing things that not only do not fit the usual criteria of the things that we know exist out there, but it's doing things that don't even seem to observe the usual characteristics of what keeps something aloft. So when you have expert witnesses saying these things, then you should take it seriously. And so it was at least refreshing, I'll say, to hear Sean Kirkpatrick saying that. Will also give you this. I'll say the possibility is that he perhaps doesn't want to throw his superiors under the bus and doesn't want to come out complaining, yes, of course, I need Title 50 authorities. Give it to me yesterday. Otherwise, I can't do my job, damn it. He could say that, but he might think that that's inappropriate. And he may be a career person. I think people have suggested he is. And so he thinks maybe the more appropriate way to respond here is to say, I think I have what I need publicly, then maybe privately he will start saying, yeah, maybe it is something else we need here. And maybe next time when Gillibrand or someone asks him to do everything you need in that kind of hearing, perhaps he'll speak up more. So we can be charitable, but I think if nothing else, what we should be struck by is how different his tone is, his comments are from what are coming from people much, much higher in the chain from him, one step down from the White House, clearly making this legislation in cooperation and coordination with the White House. So we talked about this before we went on the air. We have Tim Burchett and people in the House working with hearings coming up and being very, very specific and saying things like, disclosure is done. We're done with the cover-up. I'm sick and tired of the pushback, the cover-up, the people even within Congress, right? We have Tim Burchett coming out and saying really remarkable things about, I think some people are being duped, some people are being manipulated, some people are being blackmailed in Congress into not being honest about this. So you have that happening on the House. You have the Senate with the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, one of the most powerful people in the country in terms of political power, crafting this legislation, being so specific. We have White House spokespeople coming out and saying, not only, yes, there's a there, but why are you people so slow to pick up what we've always been saying? Again, that remarkable tone shift. All this is happening at the very same time. It's such a short order of time that we have to ask ourselves again, why is there not just a shift? Why is there such a coordinated shift? What is behind the curtain, so to speak, that is prompting this remarkable turn of events.
Yeah, it does seem to be very highly coordinated amongst all these different branches and groups. And to say that is rare is an understatement. So it's particularly peculiar there. So with this press conference that Burchett and Luna directed just a couple of days ago, you alluded to some things that were said, but they did talk about a little bit more of their own experience and kind of why they wanted to be, championing this and what they intend to do. Obviously, Burchett's been a bit of a firebrand on this topic, and many people are aware of that. But even the Democrat who was present there, was enthusiastic. They were high-fiving. He was high-fiving his Republican counterpart after the press conference. But they were talking about sort of being denied, when they went to look at some things. They went to an Air Force base, and they were, kind of met with a very bristly, I think, Air Force general there who kind of gave them the runaround, and they weren't happy with that, essentially giving several different anecdotes about how the government seems to be kicking and screaming and being dragged to these kinds of hearings, and that they're done with it. They're tired of it. It's over, and it's time for the American people to get some truth here. And that, again, echoing some of the things that Schumer said in his public statements. And then we know the whistleblower names, right? This was I know kind of had a few reactions in the social media community. We know that there are three, that it will be David Grush, David Fravor, and Ryan Graves. Obviously, many people should be, at least if you had an interest in this for a while, very familiar with David Graver. Commander Fravor was the infamous pilot of I think it was an F-18, and went out with the Tic Tac, the Nimitz incident. Ryan Graves, who was also part of a squadron that was in training over the Atlantic and was seeing these objects all the time. His the famous object description he is known for relaying is the cube within a sphere, where the cube points of the cube touch the outside of the sphere. The sphere happens to be translucent. And he's been making the rounds on the news channels quite a bit. Fravor less so. He's been a little bit less public. But he and Fravor, in fact, recently were doing a podcast together on Ryan Graves' merged podcast. And they alluded, that was interesting timing, I thought. They were having that conversation before it was announced that they would be part of this hearing. But they alluded to the fact that there would be a documentary coming out that would be a game changer, quote unquote. So there's a lot of interesting players involved here. And of course, there's a lot of frustration as well amongst those who've been following this topic very closely. But what is your take generally on the hearing that will be taking place on the 26th and these particular whistleblower individuals who will be providing testimony?
Well, the first thing that occurs to me is that when we think about names like Ryan Graves, David Fravor, taking David Grush out of it for a second, those names, like you said, have been around for a long time. And for those of us in ufology, that case has been discussed ad nauseum almost. And it goes back to the 2017 article in the New York Times. But I think when you're someone like Tim Burchett and you're getting ready, or, Congresswoman Anna Luna, and you're getting ready to hold a press conference like this, a hearing like this, you recognize the majority of the American public don't know who these people are and don't know their story. So you kind of have to rehash some of the things that have been talked ad nauseum about in ufology so that the general public is caught up to date. And some of the best information we have so far in terms of credible witnesses observing remarkable things are those people. Again, getting back to that thing about expert pilots and what they can bring here. I think one thing we should point out here is that this hearing will be remarkably different, I think, than what we've had before. When we think about the last hearing where we had Gillibrand coming out and asking some sort of softball questions being lobbed Sean Kirkpatrick's way, and it really was his show, and he could say what he wanted, and he sort of, again, drummed into this like really dry, super methodical, objective, scientific approach, many people looking at it, multiple layers of analysis, then, corroboration. And again, it almost bored you to death with the sort of science speak, but that was, again, NLP, right? This was meant to be the case. This is going to be very different. This is going to be, I think, spearheaded by people who want to get the information out. They do not want to lob softballs. They want to go with the real nuggets of gold. So they're going to ask much better questions. And this is one of the things I brought up on social media. the success and impact of these hearings really begins with the quality of the questions. So clearly, when we think about, again, I think about that one hearing that happened where we have people saying, yeah, I'm not aware of that. Sorry. No, I don't know. No, I'll check on that for you. These are the kind of answers, right? It was like so, again, the obfuscation, ask direct questions about the Wilson Davis notes. And no, we're not aware of that. Like things that should be, front and center for people who are supposedly the politicians and the military personnel looking into these things, just saying flatly, no, I have no knowledge of that. And again, doing it in a way that they can get away with it because they're using some sort of technicality about we're only looking at this specific information. Again, this is where we have to talk to people about how much of a game this is, right? Because people can answer under oath and still technically not be lying because they're talking about what they have jurisdiction to look at under their current role. And so they can answer from that point of view and it be still truthful technically that maybe they don't know within that context about the Wilson Davis notes, even though darn well they do outside of that context. So for any of us watching those kind of hearings, it was an exercise in frustration, both in terms of the original questions, the lack of follow-up, and how these witnesses were basically going in, stonewalling and laying bricks, and there's nothing that we could do about it. We felt very ineffective and helpless watching from the sidelines. This is going to be a very, very different kind of hearing. Here we have people who have already publicly stated, I'm talking about the politicians involved, Burchett and Luna and whatnot, saying, we know there's a there. We've already seen the cover-up in place. We've recently had to deal with, quote unquote, BS from military personnel, Air Force personnel who tried to obfuscate, tried to deny us information that we have every right to access as representatives of the American public. So these are the people running this hearing. They are already wanting to get this out. They are inviting witnesses who have been some of the most outspoken witnesses from the military about the reality either of objects that are unidentified or, in David Grush's case, programs that exist that clearly speak to a legacy program involving alien recovered vehicles and the attempted re-engineering of those vehicles and alien bodies, and even talk about the pilots behind these vehicles. So these are the people they're inviting who have every intention to want to get this out. They're the people who have really risked much to actually try to get this out. We think about David Grush, and they're being paired with politicians who want the exact same thing. So this is to be a very, very different kind of occasion. And I think many of us, all of us, will look back and say, where were you on July 26th? Just like you talked about when you were at the Denver airport when the Schumer legislation came out. This is going to be another one of those days, and we're going to have more and more of these where we look back and say there was these momentous days of our lives that happened in a very short order of time because, again, we are in the midst of disclosure as we speak.
Mm. And if I were to guess on the order of witness testimony, I would think that they'll probably start with David Fravor, having that firsthand eyewitness experience with the Nimitz encounter. And then we'll probably go to Ryan Graves to talk more broadly about kind of the stigma. I mean, he's a big proponent of reporting and the process of making it okay for pilots to talk about what they're seeing. He's interviewed several of them with amazing stories, talked about the momentum that he's seeing about the stigma fading away and more people being willing to talk about their stories. So I would imagine he will be second, and then I would hope they would end with David Grush and that he would get the majority of the remainder of the floor time for some really pointed questions. And we know that there are certain things he can say and certain things that he can't say. So I don't think we're going to get every little revelation that we might want. We could get a few new things that he hasn't said thus far with his interview with Ross. And we could get some additional hints. I do expect we'll see even some pushback from representatives who will be part of this committee. There might be some who are highly skeptical, who will introduce some, very pointed, critical questions, highlighting their skepticism. So I would anticipate that, be prepared for that. I would also be interested to see, and it may or may not happen, but we could certainly see some senators who decide to show up for this committee hearing as well. That's been known to happen. If you'll recall, Adam Schiff, Senator, attended a House hearing with Moultrie and Bray, and he wasn't a part of that committee. but I believe they have an open invitation, with the right affiliations that they can kind of show up and participate. So it'd be very interesting to see if we happen to see some senators who are involved in this conversation as well. On top of that, we have heard, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, we have heard that it's very likely that this will not be the last time we have a hearing about UAP in Congress, that we are very likely to see more and more hearings, that momentum will continue to build. I'm just kind of curious, is that what you're hearing with your sources? We've heard this from Lou Elizondo, and he's publicly stated that he believes this will be the case. But what are you hearing, that this will be the first of many, or maybe more of kind of an end cap here?
Well, I would say that what I've heard is that, yes, there's definitely more to come, and some of this will be rolled out in hearings. That's a great way to sort of deliver information in the guise of trying to learn about information. Sometimes you know darn well what the information is, and you use the hearing as a mechanism by which to express that information to the American public. I have heard some things about what's up the sleeves of some of the people involved in terms of what comes next. Again, there is very much a game plan here, and these are people I'm speaking about the politicians here, who've spent decades learning about how the public responds to certain kinds of revelations. And you can guarantee there's been all sorts of game theory and simulations run in terms of trying to understand how people are going to acclimatize to this, how they're going to metabolize this kind of information, what's the best way to roll it out. Again, I think we should speak to the fact that they're doing it so quickly, I think that goes against their first choice. I think there's something pushing that urgency. But what I think will happen next is we will think back about some of the major historic events in ufology that have been talked about. You can name them. There is a short list that you can count on one hand in terms of the most famous cases of supposed crashes, interactions with alien beings, that kind of thing. I think we're going to see some of that unearthed and some evidence presented about the nature of those events, and once and for all bring them into the realm of reality, not folklore, not superstition or hypothesizing, but actually evidence about those events historically. So once and for all, they are grounded in history as events that really took place in the 20th century, and revelations from those events that are described in detail will, I think, kick off the next series of questions in terms of what does this mean about who these beings are, where or when they're coming from, these kind of questions. I think that's what's coming next. And I think that there's a game plan already set up in terms of A leads to B leads to C. So first we have these hearings coming up, establishing that there's a there. We already have non-human intelligence, the description of the legacy programs, that's coming first. From there, we will get some confirmation around the historic events that actually took place that prompted this historic secrecy campaign, and finally set the record straight on those things. And then so finally, 75 years later, we can begin to wrestle with, what does this mean for our civilization? We've had this delay for all this time from what was known on the inside. And finally, as a people, as a species, as a civilization, we'll begin to reckon with those truths. And again, I think that's because something is coming. There's some sort of prompting that's creating this urgency that we need to begin to talk about these things on a civilization-wide kind of scale.
You and I have talked about how at times it feels almost like we're a part of a script here. Like this sort of, it seems to be unfolding in a way that is, you can't make this stuff up, basically. It's just kind of absolutely surreal and bizarre. I mean, I'm just thinking too about how today, in fact, is the opening day for Christopher Nolan's movie Oppenheimer, right? I'm talking about the dawn of the atomic age, nuclear weapons. And what do we know about that in the history of ufology? We know that not long after the dawn of that age, we began having encounters and having crashes. And so it's beyond, to me, it's beyond coincidental that we have this film from one of the world's leading directors, an amazing cast, reminding us of the tremendous power of the atom and what it has done, how it has transformed the 20th century and everything that came thereafter. And we have that happening on the eve of further discussion about UAP and UFOs. It's just an amazing story, grand story here, where all these things really weave together. And you and I have had discussions about how the way in which information or synchronicity happens, and how it is multi-layered, how our experience of time being linear in some ways kind of clouds our ability at certain times to see the connections that happen across events in history. And I'm sensing that right now, quite frankly. I'm sensing this overlay, this imprint throughout these moments where there's kind of a reoccurring rippling effect, if you will, of these momentous things. And they come back around, but they come back around and manifest themselves in different ways, and we become aware of them because of where we happen to be at our own developmental level personally, but also the developmental level of the entire human society. So I'm really thinking about that right now. Would love to get your thoughts about it. How do you think about these things and this moment and this experience?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree that somehow it points to some deeper reality. And I think that this is definitely worth discussing because, again, we're immersed in this physicalist kind of culture where we assume everything is cause and effect, and there is no intentionality behind anything. There's no purpose. Ultimately, there's no teleos behind the cosmic order. People even like Jacques Vallée have hypothesized that perhaps reality is more like a relational database, where if there's two bits of data that somehow have a relationship, then they end up manifesting in a certain way because of that relationship. And so there's a similarity here in terms of the synchronicity you were pointing to there, where sometimes we will get these remarkable happenstantial elements arise in our lives, either individually or as a collective, and say, what the chances that that would happen right alongside that and right alongside that? Again, from a physicalist point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and you just assume it's just circumstantial. It's just a coincidence, right? It's just co-arising with no meaning underlying that. But if actually reality happens on a deeper layer beyond space-time, and it's actually more driven by a meaning model. I've had these experiences I've talked about before where I feel like I'm in the undergirding substrate of physical reality where it's all about meaning waves. And what struck me most of all was how emotionally impacting that substrate was. It was anything but dry and objective and kind of mathematical. It was actually very, very emotional and it was just like waves of meaning rolling over me that were really, really impacting. And we think about what you just said there, that this movie Oppenheimer, the first time that historical event has been given the treatment it really needs to, and really by a filmmaker that's the only one in the world that could really do it justice. And I haven't seen the film yet. I want to see it tomorrow. But what I've heard is that it's from the point of view of Oppenheimer. So that will do a great job of showing the complexity, the contradictions in our culture, all of the nuances, the gray area around that entire historical event. We know that the historical figure Oppenheimer said, I have become destroyer of worlds, right? He really reckoned with, is this the right thing to do? As I mentioned on a podcast we did a few times ago, Warren Buffett came out and said recently, the challenge with something like a nuclear weapon is once you create it, you can never uncreate it. And so now, yes, maybe we got out of World War II, but here we are in the 2020s, and it's become more and more easy for any kind of nation state and perhaps even non-nation state actors to get a hold of these kinds of weapons of mass destruction. And so we may have gotten out of the Cold War relatively unscathed, but the chances that there will be a nuclear detonation and perhaps even a nuclear war increase over time because of the very fact that more and more groups will have access to these kinds of weapons, and that our consciousness, again, is being greatly outpaced. Our development of consciousness is being greatly outpaced by our development of technology. You and I, before we went on the air, were talking about, again, the challenges we're experiencing with climate change. Just want to remind people here, the 3 hottest days ever recorded in terms of global averages happened this July. Ever recorded. 3 of them. 1, 2, 3. In terms of the record books, all happened in July. We got out of June. We found out that June was the hottest June ever recorded in terms of global temperature averages. This week, I was hearing about the Chinese government is investing heavily in ethnically targeted viruses that actually will make sick and could even kill people specifically from certain ethnic backgrounds. So this, again, alongside of the rush towards to be the first to develop general AI and all the challenges that come with that, the fact that we have someone like Vladimir Putin, who, as he becomes more and more of a cornered animal, which I don't know how you could argue he's not, there's even people within his own country now trying to overthrow him. We had a coup attempt not long ago. When does he just say, once and for all, for the sake of the motherland, I'm going to light this up in Ukraine, and I'm going to go out in blaze of glory, as that Bon Jovi song says. So this is where we are, right? These are the things that are going on right now. So while all that's happening, and like you say, while we are in the midst of unprecedented languaging and communication from politicians around disclosure of non-human intelligence, and like you say, knowing that a big part of that narrative has involved UFOs showing up at our nuclear facilities or nuclear weapons facilities and demonstrating that they can shut down the silos when they need to, that being so much a part of the 20th century narrative that was never discussed publicly, really, and knowing about Jacques Vallée's work, again, around the Trinity thing, where we have the very first ever atomic detonation happening right around the time where this supposed UFO crashed. There's even been talk I've heard about those actually being crypto-terrestrials in that case, which again plays in with what we talked about earlier in terms of a sophisticated intelligence has been here all along. And of course, we've discussed this before. Which group will be most concerned about nuclear weapons and what that does to the planet? A species that's cohabitating the planet with us, but in stealth up until now. Because like you say, it's right after that that we have the sudden uptick in sightings and interactions and whatnot. But lest we forget, let's also move on to Roswell. And then you also have the notion of the extraterrestrials, quoting from Mike Masters' work again, the notion that some of these might be time travelers, even the notion that some of these technologies that have sort of I've become aware of, things like time travel, things like atomic energy, being things that might have been planted as part of a cyclical kind of pattern with beings from our future. So this is the complexity. And like you say, what's remarkable about it is that we have a historic event like what's happening with disclosure. In the very same week, we have this really impacting film documenting the moment where we split the atom and then use that to kill hundreds of thousands of people because we thought that was the right thing to do to win a war amongst our own species, while this other group was trying to warn us seemingly about that kind of weaponry by showing up and shutting down our silos and whatnot, and how all that was kept secret. So yeah, when you step back, and you and I have done this several times tonight, we step back and even we discuss these things and we bring into our metacognitive awareness, we put on the table all the elements that are in play. What's in the balance here? It just makes you step back and say, what a remarkable time to be alive. We are in some ways under a lot of pressure. People are feeling overwhelmed because of these revelations and wondering what this means. Why is there so much urgency here? But I think also we have to say we're so privileged to be amongst the first of our species that is going to be openly on a civilization-wide scale reckoning with there being other sophisticated intelligence in our midst.
Yeah, I think about attending a play and the orchestra is warming up. And if you've been to a live play on Broadway or something like that, and you're kind of milling around, the audience is getting comfortable in the theater, and you're finding your seat, you're having a conversation with those that you have attended the show with, and you begin hearing the sounds of the orchestra doing their warm-ups and getting in tune. And that's the first little hint that something is about to happen, something is about to take place, that entire experience is going to be transformed when that show begins, when the curtain comes up and that first act begins. This is what it feels like. It feels like we are at the beginning of that, amazing story. And stories, as you know, change us, that we are impacted by those experiences. And that's why we love them so much, because that's what has made us such an amazingly capable species, is our ability to craft stories and use those as means of transmitting information generationally, and that has then transformed our entire culture and our entire world. And so here we are about to absorb a new story that will have a similar effect on us, if not a more profound effect than all of those that have come before it. And so, I feel the weight of this time in a way. I'm also aware that not everybody is feeling that, right? Not everyone is tuned into this issue as you and I are, and many of our colleagues. We have talked about this many times, that it is quite strange that we are so fixated on this, and we can share the information with those who have a similar interest in other topics that we have. Our friends, our family, people who know us, and people who think similar to how we think, and we share these kinds of tidbits with them and stories with them, and it's as if it doesn't even exist. It's as if that information goes literally in one ear and out the other. And, I struggle with that sometimes because, when you're that person who is all consumed by the topic, and you want others to find interest in it as much as you do, and they're not doing that, it can feel quite frustrating. It can also feel lonely. I know some people certainly feel that from time to time. But I'm also reminded that we're dealing with a long legacy of stigma and disinformation and obfuscation. And the specter of that legacy is present in this conversation. It will be present in that hearing. It's going to be present in our society for a while. We're kind of going to be doling out flashlights, if you will. We're going to be doling out flashlights, people who can take them, turn them on, and then banish these shadows. And that's what we want. We want to banish the shadows of disinformation, of the lies, of the stigma, so that we can see clearly. And I believe that will happen. And I just want to remind folks, it may not happen as fast as you want, and it may not happen as completely as you want. And people need to get comfortable with that. I see a lot of reaction from the folks who are so interested in this, that they want all the truth. I deserve to know the truth. I'm an adult, and I want all the truth, and I want it right now. They've been lying to us. Disclose it all. And, I'm not so sure that's going to happen. And I think we need to be comfortable with not knowing everything, but knowing enough that it will be transformative for us. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when you talk about, friends, family, colleagues that are not wrapped up in this the way that we are, I think we should start there. You and I, before we went on the air, were talking about that, how even some people close to us maybe are not as engaged as we would like to be. I know Bryce Zabel has talked about that. Even his family, even now, he can't get them to really stomach this conversation. And I think if we're uncharitable, we might say these people are superficial, they're caught up in vain pursuits, they're missing this bigger question, the biggest questions we should be asking about the nature of reality. Are we alone? What's the purpose of life? Those kind of things. But I think the way that I look at that is that actually people are in our fast-paced world where there's always more information than you could possibly take in. And people have fast-paced lives where they have to try to balance career, family, many, many concerns, mental health. Many people not having the privileges you and I have to be able to spend time thinking so much about these topics and running a podcast and those kind of things. There's many reasons for that speak to the state of our culture, the state of our civilization. And I think people have adopted coping mechanisms in the midst of that kind of cruel, fast-paced, if you don't keep up, you will get run over kind of thing, kind of nature of our culture, that people have learned how to blur out information that doesn't, from their perception, immediately impact what they need to pay attention to, because modern life is so overwhelming already that they just say, unless literally it's come in front of my car on the roadway on the way to work, it's not real for me. And it's not just because they are lackadaisical people who couldn't care less about really important issues. It's that they're actually already feeling so overwhelmed And so they try to carve out this really narrow pattern by which they can make their way through a really chaotic world. And for instance, one of the things I want to teach and model in some of the courses I have coming up is how we actually deal with that, how we actually can address that rather than trying to guilt or shame people into, come on, take the important things seriously. We need to address what it is about modern life that makes us take on those kinds of perspectives and those kinds of coping mechanisms, what they really are. And that's one of the things I think that we will need to fundamentally rethink, is how we've gotten to this kind of conundrum right now. Why are we so divided? Why do we believe completely different narratives about the nature of reality and how our country should be run? How can we begin to relate to each other as human beings? How do we strip back all of the layers of insecurity, coping mechanisms, obfuscation in our own lives that we've self-created because of the challenges we faced growing up and the culture we were in? How do we begin to roll that back? We talk so much about technological innovation, and now AI and general AI is now becoming a threat, but we also talk about all the great things we have that our parents and grandparents didn't have. But what we sometimes don't talk about is the cost of all of that, how it's dehumanized us in many ways, and again, forced people into these different coping mechanisms. So I think we need to keep all that in mind and not be so judgmental of our neighbors, our friends, our family that haven't taken this as seriously as we have. We seem to have received the anti-venom, which allows us to sort of take this in and take it seriously. Some people have not been so privileged. Maybe that's the way to look at it. And in the midst of an overwhelming life for many people, on top of that, they're going to have to ground this. This is what's very clear, that this is not going to be something for very much longer that they can deny. And so we need to think about how we can be an aid to people when they begin to metabolize this.
Yeah, I was about to say, we haven't said the word metabolize yet, but we definitely will now. And I think about
Are you feeling discombobulated by the fact that we haven't said metabolized?
It was highly discombobulating. We've got to make a bingo card at some point. It's too good. If you're playing along at home, it's a drinking game. So, all right. So what I'm thinking about here is, and you'll be familiar with this, and I apologize to our listeners for the number of times over the course of our show where I dip into my Christian background and I pull out a metaphor that is familiar to me from that upbringing. But you'll be familiar with that metaphor of the church and the body of the church and different people with different gifts, and I think about the human family in that way, right? So that there are many people who are performing essential functions that a body performs. That are entirely different from the functions that others perform. Yet you need every single one of them to have a functioning body. You need every single aspect of that to have a fully functioning person. And so, I think that for some of us, in a very real sense, we are kind of at the forefront of metabolizing this information to then disseminate that information and energy throughout the rest of the body that performs essential functions and helps us navigate reality in a safe way. And so, we're really kind of, the body is in a way sort of first reaction, perhaps, to this information. And we're really working to incorporate it into our system, make it a part of who we are, make it digestible, make it so that other people can understand what it is and how it impacts them, and then how it changes all of us, because it will. It will change all of us, and I really think that there's a place for every person in the world, and we can really, I think we can get in our own way by insisting or demanding that people see things the way that we see them. That they have to come around to our particular perspective. We have this fixation with being right and correct, and we want to be right. We want to be correct. Everybody wants that. We need to, I think, let that go a little bit and be humble and realize that there's a certain degree of fallibility in all of us, right? We need to be, in a way, kind of celebrating that fallibility because it's something we all share. And so, I encourage folks to be present to that truth, because not everyone is going to handle this the way that you might handle it. Not everyone is going to be willing to, absorb this information. There's going to be a lot of pushback from many folks as well. And we talked about before, quite a bit of grief, perhaps, as we go through the stages of digesting everything that this entails, or at least everything that we can be told that it might entail. And so we've danced around, this entire show. We've alluded to it quite frequently. We've danced around this issue, but as we kind of turn the corners at the very end, why the urgency, right? Why the acceleration? Why is it picking up so fast right now? I feel like we were on we were like on cruise control before, and it was a pretty easy drive, and now it feels like we've hit the accelerator. So what do you think is going on here? What is the change?
Well, I'd like us to bounce back and forth a little bit on this, because I think there's a few things to tackle. First thing to bring up is that many people, to me, have said, do you think this has to do with the 2026, 2027 prognostication around something major happening? People like John Ramirez have talked about this notion of something major happening in 2027 that the intelligence circles know about, that the military groups know about, that politicians know about, and that, again, as I've hinted at on previous podcasts, the beginning of the changing in policy and tone that we noticed in 2017, in terms of acknowledging that there was a there, that UAP are real, that was the beginning of this entire conversation, that was part of a 10-year rollout leading up to 2027, because something major was going to happen, some sort of major reveal, not necessarily something cataclysmic, apocalyptic, but just something in terms of that would shake our worldview was going to come into focus. And so there was this sense of an obligation, a responsibility to begin to prepare people for that event. What I have noticed, though, is that, again, the pace of change over the last few weeks seems like it's going to get us there well before 2026, 2027. You think about, if you were to sort of graph this, you look at the ascent of the line going towards 2027 from 2017, suddenly we see this sudden uptick turning north, because it seems like it's happening much sooner than that. So what I have said to people is that, so I'll begin with here and then pass over to you to get your thoughts on it. And maybe it'd be great if you could give your honest take on, did part of you have that same concern? Because Bryce Abels talked about, he sat himself down and said, what's really going on here? And again, we can talk about how that even fed into people's fears by him just trying to be honest about his own process. But I think what seems clear to me is that the pace of things is suggesting this is something prior to 26, 27. I would say to people that these things are not fixed in stone. As I've said on this podcast and on Point of Convergence, this is a dynamic process involving different human groups that want different things, different non-human / non-conventionally human groups that want different things. This is a dynamic process, a power play going on, negotiation, if you will, between these different groups. I know to many people that will be overwhelming. They want to make this a nice, clean thing. They can be introduced to this one group, like on Close Encounters of the Third Kind or something. It's not like that. It's a complex, cosmopolitical kind of situation that we're going to be stepping into here. And it's deep, deep waters. So I think that something has arisen more recently that's made it clear that this is not in preparation for 26, 27, but something before that is happening. Before we dive into that more, what were your initial thoughts when you reflected on the seeming uptick in the urgency?
I've heard a lot over the last couple of years, things that you have shared with me, and things, of course, that I hear from others in the community and in the history of this subject, particularly those who have been experiencers as well, where it wasn't hard for me to jump to the scary places when you start talking about acceleration and urgency and those kinds of things. But I also I do see it more from your perspective, and from the perspective of a revelation, not a catastrophe. I mean, in some respects, look, when there is enough information that changes the way you understand who you are and your place in the world, that is a catastrophe of a kind, because the person that you were is dying. That person is going to be dead, and a new person will be following in its wake, because you will be living in a new reality. And sometimes we can look back at our life. We can see those moments very clearly when that happened. to us. We've hopefully, if you've lived long enough, that'll happen to you. You look at your life and realize, after that moment, I was a different person. Oftentimes, hopefully it's for the better. I had a better life after I made that choice. So it's sometimes not. After that happened to me, that accident or whatever, things got a lot harder. But I also know from my own experience, from the experience of my father, who was dealt a pretty hard hand when he was a kid, that challenge, that thing that really impacted his life and changed his life forever, it could have been construed as a catastrophe, something terrible. And I think at the time, and probably, he felt that many, many nights when he was a young person, that why did this happen to him? But I also look at who he is now, and I realize that shaped who he became. And he refused to, sort of be defeated by that, and became a better person as a result of it. So, I take that lesson very much to heart, that the adversities that we encounter, whether that's, scary information that changes the way that you think what you think you knew to be true, or, positive news, whatever it is, we need to take these as opportunities, as moments where we can improve and rise above that and become a better version of who we were. And, I look at it from that perspective, and I, in a way, kind of welcome these sorts of changes, because, to think that they won't happen is naive, right? Life is all about change.
Truly said. Now, in regards to this urgency, this is something I tweeted earlier this week. I said, if you're thinking that the speed at which everything is ramping up is not just surprising, but perhaps speaks to the establishment of some underlying timeline according to which events are now unfolding, my response would be to say, you're not wrong. And I really do hold to that. I think that there has been the establishment of a timeline, and that's what explains the sudden ramp up in disclosure. Again, I don't think any of us in our wildest dreams thought that disclosure would roll out like this, that suddenly all of our favorite terms are being used, where the notion of different hypotheses is being bandied about so quickly. Really, it's not seemingly being driven by how quickly can the public metabolize this, but rather how important is it that this becomes part of the public conversation in preparation for something, right? Now, many people have spoken to this cataclysm issue that may be coming. I covered many times on Point of Convergence. We've talked about it here on Liminal Frames. The notion that some of these may be extraterrestrials who've come back, different factions around some sort of coming cataclysm, and there's some sort of, again, dynamic situation where perhaps that's trying to be avoided in some way, and that this may play into that to try to avoid some sort of cataclysm. That's one possibility. That's one narrative. That's been very, very central. I want to say that to people. That's very much been part of what I've been aware of, and there's even things I'm aware of that I haven't been able to say publicly, but I think we really need to keep that in mind, that I think that's definitely part of what's going on here. And also point out that it's not just, in terms of possibilities, it's not just that the only possibility is that the government knows something's coming, so that's why they have decided of their own volition to disclose now. There's also the distinct possibility that I think I want to introduce to people is what's in the mix here as well, is that the others, the non-human intelligence or the non-conventionally human intelligence themselves are dictating some of this timeline. What it seems to be happening, I've noticed, is that many people are just assuming we are the only ones dictating and determining the timeline here. And I want to remind people that the entire nature of this revelation is that we are not alone. There are other ones on the scene. And so what I want to leave people with is that they also have had a hand in why this is happening now and why it's happening as quickly as it's happening. So keep that in mind whenever you weigh these issues.
I'm going to leave it there. That's a great point to land on, and I know we'll absolutely want to come back to that one on a future episode, so look forward to that conversation. So thank you all for listening. It's been a pleasure. Good to be back, and we look forward to future episodes and conversations with you. Thank you for your feedback and your likes and your shares. It means a great deal to us, and provides a great deal of encouragement as we continue to provide this content to you. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.